In this content, we're talking about relationships and the power of love. We'll begin by looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You'll probably be familiar with this, but he suggests going from bottom to top that we need these needs, need to have these needs met in sequence. So initially, we have physiological needs, things that our body simply needs in order to survive: air, water, food, shelter, sleep, protection for our skin by way of clothing of some sort, and often reproduction is considered among these physiological needs. And once those physiological needs are met, we have our basics that we need for our body, we begin to look around for safety and security. So personal security, like living in a safe place, employment, that keeps us safe, having some sort of a job or income, so we have money, resources, a place to live, like a decent place to live, health, access to health care, property adequate to meet our needs. So those we consider, those that are basic and fundamental to us, we consider to be our safety needs, the things that allow us to be safe in the world that we live in. So whatever that is in your world would be included in this category, but the luxuries wouldn't be included in this category generally. And so if you're in a situation where you either have to sacrifice your health or your job, in most cases you would sacrifice your job because your health is a physiological need and you serve physiological needs before safety needs. But look what comes next. So these are both involved with like keeping your body and your being well and healthy and surviving. But look what's at this next level: love and belongingness. And so this includes just having a network. We as humans are vulnerable. We don't have our claws. We don't have our talons or our fast running speed or our fur to keep us warm. None of that. We have to keep ourselves warm and protected. And to do that, we need a social structure. We need others in our lives. We can't survive alone. And so friendship, people who have our backs, intimacy, people we can share our secrets, our innermost being with, family, those people who are just our blood, our kin, even if we mess up, and a sense of connection with the world around us, like having a place, belonging. So this is the level that we're looking at in this chapter, these relationships. And then beyond that, so once these needs are met, considered fundamental needs, then we can go into the things that are related to esteem, like getting respect from others, feeling good about yourself, building your social status, maybe by way of education, further education, or improved employment, gaining recognition, maybe taking leadership in community efforts, or doing talks that gain you recognition. Strength, freedom, all of these are esteem-based values, but generally these rest on the backs of these previous three. So if our physiological needs aren't being met, certainly if we're can't get enough air, then certainly we're not going to be worried about whether we've been recognized or people responded to that Facebook post or something like that. And if we're unsafe, if we live in a bad neighborhood, we don't feel our children are safe, something like that, we're probably going to be worried about that more so than whether we can gain the respect of our fellow community members. And if we're alone, we're isolated, we have no group, we have no one behind us, no one with our back, these areas will suffer too, these esteem areas. And then the very highest level, being the most that one can be, once we've sort of achieved all of these, and we're no longer striving for these, for self-esteem or for a role in society or for success, then we seek the things that allow us to be the most we can be. And usually this comes along with like spiritual practices, or like compassion for others, or generosity, caring for those around us. Those are those highest level values that generally rest on the backs of all of these. And so I share this because if love and belongingness are absent, the higher levels are weakened, and that's why these relationships are so very essential to our well-being. So let's define intimacy. We can think of it as an emotional attachment between two people characterized by three things: concern for each other's well-being, a willingness to disclose private and sometimes sensitive topics. So you will divulge those things that you might be embarrassed or shy about divulging to most people, but with your intimate connections, you'd be willing to disclose these things. And then usually sharing of common interests and activities. So when we think of this emotional attachment named intimacy, this is what we think of. Intimacy does not have to co-occur with sexuality. So you can have a romantic relationship that includes a sexual dimension, but that's not necessary for intimacy. You can have intimate friends that have all of these three characteristics met without having a sexual relationship. Even with your parents, with your siblings, your children, where you would never have a sexual relationship, you could still have an intimate relationship. And it takes time. Very often it takes in childhood. It usually is engaged in shared activities. So when children are beginning this process of developing friendships and intimate relationships outside of family, it usually begins with shared activities. They do things together. They go play in the park, or they play with a certain toy that they have, or even playing a video game or something like that. That's generally how this plays out initially, with shared activities. Then later, as teens get to know themselves better, just early teens, it emerges further into self-disclosure and trust. So revealing secrets and trusting your friends with these secrets, and that usually happens in early adolescence. And then romantic intimacy, where we add the sexual component in mid to late adolescence. So Sternberg, I just thought I'd share this with you just as it is. So this is Sternberg's, it's called a love triangle. It's also, I believe, called the triarchic model. And so he offers these certain dimensions. He says there are three components to a relationship, and the strongest relationship, which he calls consummate love, has all three of the points of the triangle. It has intimacy, which we've just defined, the sharing of secrets, disclosure, and so forth. It has commitment, where the people have consciously determined that they're going to be there for each other, even if things aren't great. And it has passion, and that's that sexual component, that excitement, that dopamine-driven, that huge reward that we get for engaging with that person. And then we have relationships that don't have all three. In fact, to have a relationship that has consummate love with all three, we might even consider to be something of a rarity or an achievement. And so let's imagine that we simply have passion, like that excitement, that sexual dimension, and we like a person, we share secrets with them, we have intimacy. Well, that would be a characteristic of romantic love. But the people who are having the romantic love may not have made a commitment. They might be too young, or the situation might not allow it, and so that's where it is. They don't have a commitment. If they have liking, they share intimacy, and they're committed, he would call that companionate love. So these are companions. They share secrets with each other, they like to do the same things, and they're committed. They've decided to stick with each other through thick and thin. Companionate love. They don't have that passion component. Maybe they had it at one time, but they no longer have it. If they have commitment and passion, but not intimacy, so they're committed to each other and they have a strange sexual connection that they engage in, that's called fatuous love, but they lack the intimacy, the sharing of secrets, the disclosure, the vulnerability that you can have with an intimate partner. And of course, each of these can occur alone. You can have a marriage, for example, where two people are committed to each other, but they don't share intimacy, they don't share secrets or self-disclose. They don't like to do the same things, and they don't have that excitement about the other person either. And he would call that empty love. And some marriages unhappily end up that way, this empty love, where there's nothing but a commitment, which is a conscious choice. Or there might be this intimacy alone. All there is the sharing of this friendship, this intimate, the secrets, the self-disclosure, but there's no passion, no sexual energy, and there's no commitment. And this is like friendship. This is just liking. And finally, There might be two people who share passion, like a sexual excitement, but they're not committed to each other, and they don't really share secrets. It's just the sexual dimension, and that would be, or we might say, the excitement of that person. And maybe they don't even know the person well enough to know whether they would self-disclose or commit. And in that case, he would call it infatuation. There's nothing there but that excitement. So how happy is your relationship, and how do we measure it in Western psychology, at least? So very often it's measured in Western psychology simply by self-report, meaning each partner would fill out a survey about their relationship satisfaction. But there are some other ways that we can get an indication besides self-report, which isn't the best way to measure satisfaction. We could look at how they talk. If the two people are talking about things that they do and you hear the word "we" a lot, that's a positive indicator. And a therapist working with couples will look at that and say, well, there's some good aspects of this relationship. If they have a lot of contempt, they're talking about their relationship and they have micro expressions, which are just small fluctuations in the facial expression that indicate contempt, that would be a negative indicator. That's a really strong predictor that the relationship isn't going to survive. There's like this, it's a disdain for the other person that almost feels like a dismissal, not hatred, but a really negative feeling toward the other person. It's hard to save that relationship once contempt emerges. And sometimes we can look at overlap of circles. One could ask each person in a relationship to draw a circle that represents their life, and then to draw a circle that represents their partner's life, and then draw them and then move them to show how much of that overlaps. So how much of your significant other's life overlaps with your life. And this example right here, would be reasonably healthy, and even to have more overlap would be healthy. But some circles will be completely overlapping, which is not healthy. This is like a codependent relationship. And some circles will be barely touching at all, and that's also not healthy, because there's not enough shared existence, not enough proximity and shared activities. We have different motivations for relationships. Some people are motivated in a way that's called communal, and that is they expect the relationship to endure. They take responsibility for the relationship, and they feel as one. They feel that they are so connected with that other person that they put the self before the other. Like they're willing to sacrifice their own needs, or they see the needs of the other as equivalent to the needs of the self. So that means they're willing to do a lot to preserve the integrity of that relationship. And so there's large overlap in those two circles if they did the circle activity. And the relationship would persist in the face even of uneven contributions. Like if one partner maybe gets depressed and just isn't able to function well for a while, the other partner will put their needs first still. And so that relationship is likely to persist if the people go into it in that communal mindset. But some other relationships are exchange relationships. Sometimes they're short-term, they're trade-based, like, oh, hey, I'm doing this, but this person's giving this, so it all balances out. That's a fair deal, tit for tat. And so they don't see any special particular responsibility toward that other person. So if the other person stops being able to provide their part of the deal, the relationship fails. So the person would be weighing out benefits I've given versus benefits I've taken and trying to keep those always equal. The two circles in the previous example would have very little overlap, really. They're not sharing that much of life. And if one of the people becomes injured or unable to contribute in the same way, the relationship might be vulnerable. It might not survive that. We can think now of neurotransmitters involved in relationship, and you're going to be watching a few videos that expand on these, and these are required videos that are linked on Blackboard. And so we think of lust, which is that sexual energy, or we might say the passion piece of the model we just looked at. Those are driven by testosterone in particular. That's the one that drives like action in that direction. And then estrogen is a sort of a prime receptivity that when the woman's estrogen is highest, when she's ovulating, she would be very also more receptive emotionally to having a relationship. And that's the sexual component. Attraction is driven by dopamine, and dopamine is your reward neurotransmitter. And so dopamine is going to give you just rewards for being in the presence of that person or getting a positive feedback from that person. Norepinephrine is like adrenaline. It's going to give you that racing heart rate. And serotonin is also involved. We usually think of that in association with depression, but it's also involved in these feelings of attraction. And so lust is the sexual piece. Attraction is that heart racing piece. And then attachment is like that commitment piece. And that's driven not by dopamine, by those little heart racing rewards, but by oxytocin, which we'll be talking about in our class examples, as related to trust and like a hormone that's produced after a mother gives birth, for example, that helps her to bond with her baby. But it also emerges, say, after sex or after the orgasmic part of sex. We'd also have a surge in oxytocin, which tends to make people feel attached to people with whom they have sex, even if they thought they weren't going to. And then vasopressin is talked about in this little 2 or 3 minute Voles video as also related to attachment. There are 3 factors that increase the likelihood of forming an intimate relationship with someone, and these are well documented in the research, and I'll just highlight them here. Your book talks about them more. Proximity, just being near to each other. Like, you're more likely to fall in love with someone who lives near you, who's your neighbor, than someone who's far away. And part of that is because we just encounter that person more often, and as we encounter them more often, they begin to feel familiar to us. It's like the first breaking through of someone who's unfamiliar. That person is now familiar. You've seen each other regularly, even if you've never talked, and so that's like an icebreaker. Similarity is shared interests. Like, if you have something in common, and an interest is great. You both really enjoy hiking, or you both share your political views, or even sharing a race if you're not the majority, like if it represents like a particular dimension that's important in your environment. But people can even feel better toward another person if the similarity is in something as trivial as the first letter of their name. Or even if you just give people an arbitrary symbol and say, okay, you're randomly assigned to be a member of the Fünf group, and the rest of those over there are members of the Sieben group. And even just knowing that someone else has been randomly assigned to be in the same group as you can lead to a greater liking for that person. And you'll often see this when children are first learning in those early adolescent years, when they're first learning to form their intimate relationships. This bond, this shared similarity might be based on disliking someone else. Like the in-group is bonded together because they all dislike that person over there. And so those kind of negative in-group, out-group associations can be part of the similarity dimension. And then physical attractiveness, finding that person physically attractive, and sometimes finding them similar to your own level of attractiveness can be a third dimension. And we do have typical gender differences among heterosexual people in terms of their mate preferences. So women tend to be more attracted to power and strength. And you can think of this as being adaptive. If we think of an adaptive model, that women have to have some protection because they are vulnerable when they're pregnant. The women are vulnerable, and they also need to protect their children after they're born. So from an evolutionary standpoint, a woman would benefit in terms of being able to reproduce if she is with a male who has strength or power. Now, what is strength or power? Well, you see so often, what appear to be attractive women with a man who really physically isn't attractive, has let himself get out of shape, or many other number of things like that. And so strength and power manifest in today's world often as money or status, or some sort of recognition in the community. And so from an adaptive perspective, women tend toward that group. Women tend to rate those men as more attractive, let's just say it that way, men who have status and power. And men prefer physical attractiveness. And from a male perspective, evolutionary perspective, this would also be adaptive, because you've read now that attractiveness is based on generally on like symmetry in the features. That's generally what is regarded as attractive across cultures, to have this sort of symmetry. And symmetry in features represents healthy genetics. And so if both men and women want to reproduce, if that's the primary goal from an evolutionary perspective of sex, reproduction, then both people would have these innate emotional or primitive responses to aspects of the opposite sex that would promote that capacity to reproduce. So for women, a man who has strength and power promotes her capacity to reproduce. And for a man, being attracted to a physically attractive woman would increase his possibility of reproducing, because she would be healthy and bear healthy offspring. So that kind of takes into account an evolutionary framework. But we do find these to be consistent patterns among males and females even now. And these are some of those unconscious things that we're often unaware of. So we're going to take a look at the stages of a relationship. So initially, before the relationship begins, there is that attraction piece. And usually we decide whether we're attracted in 1.5 to 4 minutes. And it's not based on words. So more than half is just through body language, like the way the person carries himself, or the eye contact, or something about the smile, like very subtle cues. 38% is just through the tone and speed of their voice. So we hear the voice, and that adds to the attractiveness. And only 7% is through the words that they say. So there are many subtle cues that determine whether we find someone attractive. Aaron is a big researcher in this area, and he teaches some big classes at another university, and he actually works with us a little bit. He asks each student to find a complete stranger that they've never met before in a class that might have a couple hundred students. So each student finds the stranger, and then they take about a half an hour to share about their lives. So they talk together, and they're both asked to share some intimate details about their lives. And then at the end of that, they stare deeply into each other's eyes without talking for 4 minutes. And just doing these things, the outcome is that these two people become deeply attracted. One couple even got married in his first year doing this. The attraction was so deep. And so just taking this time to reveal yourself, and then following it with this eye contact, which is a sort of it's very vulnerable to look deeply into someone's eyes, and making yourself that vulnerable, this really promoted attraction. So I guess if you have someone you want to have a more intense relationship with, then you could spend a half hour talking intimately and look deeply into each other's eyes and see what happens. Adolescents and adults are more likely to choose someone who's similar to them on several dimensions, and someone who's nearby, so that those criteria hold out. The second stage is infatuation, and it doesn't necessarily follow having shared all these secrets, because infatuation often occurs for someone that you've never even spoken to. So it's a feeling that you love and admire this person, and you might be perseverating or really focusing on them. You might be aware of their presence wherever they are. It might be someone, if you can picture yourself at those early stages of adolescence, someone who sits in front of you, say, in some sort of a gathering, and you maybe never even saw this person's face for a very long time, but you just felt this infatuation. It's not necessarily reciprocated, but it can lead to the feeling that the person reciprocates. So the one who is infatuated with another person that they maybe don't know well at all or have barely talked to, but the infatuation is present, this person is vulnerable to misreading cues from the other person. So if that person, totally unaware of this infatuation, walks by them and gives a little smile, the one who is infatuated may easily interpret that little smile as, oh, she likes me too, or he likes me too. So this is some of those risks that happen during this stage. The hormones that are working at that time are the adrenaline, the norepinephrine, which makes your heart race and your palms sweat. Dopamine, which is these pleasant chemical surges, the reward that you get for doing certain things. And serotonin, your serotonin levels decline in a way that's similar to obsessive compulsive disorder. So that allows you to become obsessed and compulsive about this person. So it's kind of a vulnerable state. And so what stressors could occur at this stage? Well, one of the main stressors is lack of reciprocation. And so this can, if this person doesn't respond by liking you back, this can lead to a decrease in self-esteem because you're having this decreased serotonin already. And so this would lead to almost a despair or a humiliation or a general feeling that you must not be desirable. This can lead to sometimes an enduring negative emotional state, and we'll talk more about the type of people who are vulnerable to these. The adolescent would have to deal with this rejection and the loss of the fantasy that has probably consumed a lot of their time. And then, as I mentioned, individual characteristics might make one particularly prone to depression during this time. So that discovery that, nope, you're being rejected, you're not liked, you're not wanted, then some people can fall into a depression at that time. We'll revisit this later. These are links to different videos. I have required a couple of them of you. So the second stage is the dyadic stage. So this is when someone has in fact reciprocated this affection. And so now you're together, you're a couple, and you have sharing of both positive and negative feelings. So when you're feeling good, you share it with the person. When you're feeling bad, you're talking about goals for your relationship. So you're starting to have those conversations about if you committed. If you go to an event or you meet another person, you'll tend to come together and react in similar ways. So you're converging in your reactions. Your own sense of well-being might be linked to the health of the relationship. That can happen during this dyadic stage. So if the relationship is suffering, your own sense of well-being suffers. And you would view yourself as a couple. There would be a we that you're talking about. The hormones involved are oxytocin, which is this cuddle hormone, and as I've mentioned, it's released during sex and when a woman has a baby, and it amplifies your feelings, love and trust, amplified when things are good in your relationship. But if things are suffering, the oxytocin also amplifies like jealousy and possessiveness. And then vasopressin is a long-term attachment hormone, also released in sex, that you'll listen to in the moles video. Then possible stressors making the relationship work are sexual decision-making, having to decide, especially if you're young, whether you're going to have a sexual relationship and how you're going to protect yourselves, whether you should be true to each other. Hopefully both partners are in agreement, but maybe not. And then this is the stage where violence might emerge, and this is more prevalent in rural areas, maybe because there are fewer diversions, and maybe because the things that are done in spare time so often involve drinking alcohol. So those two factors make violence a greater problem in rural areas. And then the last stage of a relationship is the termination stage, and this could be a breakup or a death. So it's characterized by initial sadness for as long as 8 months. So just a sadness. But gradually there's a recovery for most people. The hormones involved are cortisol, which is a stress hormone, reducing in immunities. So you might get sick during this time. There's a lot of challenges involved in cortisol and stress that can be talked about in other settings. And then serotonin, it's still low. Remember, serotonin drops when you're in love. It's what it sort of does is it drops, and the drop in serotonin opens you up to take in the other person. And so because serotonin is also low during depression, then a person can be vulnerable to depression. And the stressors that might increase vulnerability to depression, about half of people with major depressive disorder had a breakup in the past year, so that they're not able to recover from that low serotonin that incorporated the relationship. And so major depressive disorder would emerge 8 months after the breakup. That's typically, if a person is not recovering at that point, then this might be major depressive disorder. That's not going to resolve as easily. Females are more susceptible than males because they tend to have a greater commitment. In general, females have higher levels of oxytocin that make these relationships more primary to their identity, in general. And the one who broke up might feel guilt and distress over having caused harm to this person, and that can also make that person vulnerable. So what about this depression triggered by romantic relationships? Well, we think about a diathesis stress model, and just to introduce the terms, a diathesis is a tendency to suffer from a certain condition, and we might add that this could be a genetic tendency, like if you have part of your inherited genetic code that makes you susceptible to depression. And then the stress is this just something that's negative in the environment, and this can trigger that drop into depression. And so if you combine this diathesis with a stressor, it means that one's tendency to suffer, one's the likelihood of suffering from this condition when a stressor emerges activates the gene, and so then the person actually drops into that depressed state. So we can look at this model in a different way. We can consider that these three things combined make a person vulnerable to, say, depression, for example, under stress. So heredity is that genetic package. The genes that come to you ready to go turned on, and possibly epigenetic, the genes that are switched because of factors in your parents' lives. Then the developmental milieu. So did you have developmental opportunities that were pretty safe, allowed you to have a secure attachment and a feeling of trust toward others and confidence and reasonable belief in yourself? And then an adverse event. And so we can think of adverse events as things that happened earlier that might have your parents get divorced, or your home burns down, things like that that happened that impacted your overall development. So these are the possible diatheses: heredity, your basic background in your family and what they instilled with you in terms of psychological health, and then the adverse events. We sometimes call them ACEs that happen. And these things combined make a person vulnerable to illness when a stressful life event occurs. And so if we have some challenges in this area, maybe you have a predisposition genetically, maybe you were raised in a home that did not support psychological health, or maybe there were many things in your background that went wrong in your childhood, in your earlier life, then when that breakup happens, it's harder for you to bounce back, for your serotonin to resolve itself, and this can lead to this drop into depression. And I have a little bit of this tiny little model here. I'm sorry for the small print, but this is just another way of looking at it that I'll just quickly go through. So here again, we have this biological vulnerability and psychological vulnerability as diatheses, and now we have this stressor. And so we can think of the activation of stress hormones impact all of your neurotransmitters, and then our cognitions, the way we think about things, can really impact us. And so we don't want to ignore that piece. So if we tend to have negative attribution styles, maybe blaming oneself when things go wrong, or just a general pessimistic outlook, or a sense of hopelessness in general, or attitudes that don't help you bounce back, or schemas that are negative, those are cognitive factors. And then if you have interpersonal problems in general, you're not good with relationships, that means that you don't have social support. And so these are a little bit of an expanded way of understanding the way that the stressful life events might contribute to depression. And so then we can look at specific characteristics that can lead to a bad response to stressors in a relationship. So women are more susceptible than men. Coping styles differ. So if you're ruminative, that is, when something goes wrong or you have a conversation that didn't go as well as you had hoped, someone who ruminates would be just going over it again and again in their mind, focusing on it, just repeating it in their mind. That's their coping style, not healthy. Then they don't have a strong sense of themselves. Like they went through this adolescent period, but when ideally teenagers find out who they are and what is their role in society, but this didn't go well. Like maybe it's this prolonged adolescence that many young people have today because of the job market and the need for a very long educational period. But this person doesn't have a strong sense of themselves. They're vulnerable then. If they have an interpersonal coping style that is somewhat agitated, they don't tend to easily resolve problems within their other relationships. So maybe they get over hyper concerned and hyper focused. That can contribute. That can be a vulnerability factor. We can look at what model of relationships they have. So if they have a model of relationships that has, say, an expectation of having the full attention at all times of another person, or a model of relationships that says that if you're not in a relationship, there's something wrong with you, then that can contribute to a challenge. There are some people who have rejection sensitivity. They have like a heightened vigilance to cues of rejection. And so they may be interpreting rejection where none has actually occurred. And so this can be a characteristic. And then their developmental level, if they're just too young, like they matured physically at an early age and they got into relationships early, maybe because their parents weren't as well able to look after them and able to provide them a strong sense of reward in the home environment. But they're just doing this too early. They're getting too involved sexually. They're just not ready. They don't have the skills to develop with the intense emotion that comes with a romantic relationship. So these are all the factors, the characteristics of individuals that makes them vulnerable to problems when something happens in one of these stages. So if they are infatuated with someone and it's unrequited, then in that case, having these factors can trigger the depressive symptoms. If they have some of these characteristics and they are in a relationship, they're dating somebody, and these stressors of having to make sexual decisions, or if someone is disloyal or sort of cheats with another person, this can lead to the disruptive symptoms. And of course, the breakup is the most difficult challenge of all that can lead to these depressive symptoms. And these often occur in adolescence when people aren't yet fully ready to have an identity on their own. And it also can occur in adults if some of those issues remain unresolved. And you'll be watching the video of Helen Fisher talking about all of these issues. So what can we derive from all of this research about the healthy self and relationships? Well, there are many things, but I'll share a few with them. And the first is identity coherence. Erickson suggests that we should not enter into relationships before we find our own identity. And by that I mean you know yourself well and you know what your role is in the world. And so because forming a relationship causes this reduction in serotonin, which means that your identity is going to be merging with another. If your identity isn't strong in the first place and you go through that merging process, there might be nothing left of you. So if you break up, it's going to be more devastating. And even if you form the relationship, it may be less strong because you don't have a sense of yourself that you're offering to the other person. You're not a fully developed human being. So become a fully developed human being before you form these sorts of relationships. The more you know yourself and the more you have a role, the more likely you are to be able to find a person who will walk with you on the long path. And then keep balance in your life. Don't get too one-dimensional. In those initial stages of falling in love, it's very easy to all other activities are less potent, less exciting, and you want to always be, individuals often want to always be with that one romantic interest, but don't give in to that. Don't sacrifice your personal interests, your personal activities, your workouts. Don't give everything up at that, because that's really what you offer. That's what you are, and you are what you are offering. So if you give all of that up, you're not really offering yourself anymore. So yes, give a lot of time to that person, but don't sacrifice your friends. Don't sacrifice your own interests or the things that are beneficial to your own well-being. In the end, you'll have more to offer if you keep balance as you enter into these heightened feelings of excitement early in a relationship. And delay sex. So as we've talked about, there are a lot of people who like to believe that sex is just a freebie, like a fun physical activity. But there seems to be always a big price to pay for sex. And so we're not suggesting that one should become puritanical and afraid of sexual activity. Sex is a really beautiful part of an intimate relationship and very important, but delay it. So don't get caught up in that passion. Let that passion linger and get to know that person well. And then if you know the person well and you have those feelings of being able to be vulnerable, of trusting that person, of respecting that person, of feeling that that person has your back at that time, that might be the right time to offer sex. And if that's, and of course, consistent with whatever your own system, your own beliefs require of you. But because there's this huge production of oxytocin, and it's linked not just to childbirth, but also to orgasm, which can, the process of the orgasm facilitates the fertilization of the egg, and so that all is connected to reproduction. And so the oxytocin surges at that point. And so it's not free usually. Like you think, some people think that it can be sort of free and of consequence, but you're taking a pretty big risk of somebody becoming hurt once you cross that road. And so delaying it just allows you to make that decision more prudently, more wisely, with more forethought. And the period of anticipation can be beneficial as well. So yeah, I wrote in there, respect your gametes, respect your ova, your eggs if you're female, respect your sperm if you're male. That's your power of reproduction. And you don't want to throw it away frivolously on just for the mere temporary pleasure and the dopamine surge. It doesn't. It's a short-term gain that doesn't have long-term overall benefits. So with that, we'll close out this content on relationships, and that's the end of this lecture.